Today I'm talking about hunting some big game theory, specifically hunting game theory 101 analyses, which you've probably seen on Twitter before, and looking into human behavior and how we can leverage attackers' cognitive models against them to improve defensive strategy. So I'm Kelly. I'm a product manager in the InfoSec world. I spend my weekends researching different things around behavioral economics and how they apply to InfoSec. So if you were at Alex Stamos's keynote this morning, he talked about how we focus on the sexy O-Day in the industry and not so much the quotidian problems. I've delved into why we do that from a behavioral and psychological point of view, because it's very true that we do. So you can check out some of that work. But today I am talking about game theory. And I portray this as game theory, specifically, again, those 101 analyses, because they've resulted in some very unsatisfactory ways of thinking about defensive strategies, and I will explain why. So if you aren't familiar with the meme, there was a meme that it's time for some game theory, and a bunch of people appropriated it. So my point is that it's now time for hunting game theory. So a question for the audience, do you believe bug-free software is a reasonable assumption? Show of hands. Very few people. I think that's pretty consistent with what most people think. Do you believe wetware is more complex than software? Basically, are our brains more complex than most software? Yeah, a lot of people. I think that's generally true as well. So traditional game theory relies on the assumption of bug-free wetware, which obviously isn't a good one. Behavioral game theory, however, assumes that there's no such thing as bug-free, which is a much more accurate model for kind of how we at Black Hat think about things. There's a good quote by the Nobel Prize-winning physicist Murray Gell-Mann, think how hard physics would be if particles could think, and I think that's very true in the InfoSec game as well. And a very, self-promotional quote by Alan Schiffman. Dan Gurr quoted him, "Amateurs study cryptography, professionals study economics." So it must be true because Dan Gurr said it. And this is what you're going to learn. First, why traditional game theory isn't actually even a theory and is unfit for strategy making. The second thing is I'm going to propose a new framework for modeling the InfoSec game based on insights gleaned from behavioral experiments. And finally, I'm actually going to give practical advice, so it's not just in the realm of theory, for new defensive strategies that exploit what's called thinking and learning in your adversaries. So let's go hunting to find out why. First, what is game theory? Because I think a lot of people talk about it, particularly, again, the Twitter sort of thought leaders, but they don't necessarily know what it is. The TLDR is that game theory is actually a mathematical language used to describe scenarios of conflict and cooperation between humans. It's really more about a language than a theory. It's really good at describing various scenarios, but it's not really good as a theory in itself because it isn't actually based on fact. So you can use it as a generative or engendering tool, but not as something to dictate optimal strategies, and I will explain why. Game theory applies whenever actions of players are interdependent. So if you make some sort of decision, it affects the decisions the other person can make. And these strategic scenarios I just mentioned include many types of games, which I'm about to detail with different sorts of solutions for each, depending on which algorithm you like. First, there's zero-sum games. So chess is one example. You have one player, you have one loser. In poker, someone wins and gets the winnings of everyone else. So it averages out to, or sums up to zero. Non-zero-sum games, so this is when basically the win and the loss don't exactly equal zero. A lot of people think of the stock market as a zero-sum game, but it isn't, because you can actually increase the wealth of everyone in the stock market, say if the economy expands. The prisoner's dilemma is another example of non-zero-sum, because both players don't directly compete with each other, they can actually cooperate. Negative-sum games, you could think of things like climate change or nuclear war. It's generally lose-lose, mutual destruction sort of scenarios. In positive-sum games, you can think about trade agreements, where in theory both economies are better off, or things like equal rights, human rights. Generally that's a win-win as well. Within these games, you have to think about the types of information, and you'll see this a lot kind of in the language of game theory. Again, thinking about it for its descriptive power. So one potential description is complete versus incomplete information. What this means is with complete information, you know the types of opponents, for example, different types of big game, and you know their motivations as well. With perfect versus imperfect information, perfect simply means you know the moves that your opponent is making. Imperfect means that you don't have that visibility. And finally, information symmetry versus asymmetry. You may be more familiar with this concept. Essentially, this means that either each player has the same amount of information as their opponent or that they don't. And it can be the same amount or it can be the quality of the information as well when you think about this. Within these sorts of games, there are things called defender, attacker, defender games, or DAD games for short. So in these DAD games, they are sequential games in which sets of players are attackers and defenders. Unfortunately, the foundations are in traditional game theory and typically look at things like terrorism, where attackers want to be maximally harmful. This isn't true in InfoSec, and it's not true for a bunch of different types of attackers, so a lot more work needs to be done. There was a paper back in March. It's the first one that really explored DAD games through the lens of behavior. And one of the interesting findings is that raising the cost of attack actually works really well empirically, and also raising the cost of defense works too. But again, we need a lot more research to glean more findings from it. The first move in any DAD game is that a defender chooses a defensive investment plan. So this could mean hardening existing infrastructure, building infrastructure that's more resilient, anything like that. And again, the goal oftentimes is the attacker observes this defensive plan and wants some sort of maximally harmful hit or some way to otherwise benefit. And the solution to a DAD game identifies what sort of infrastructure you want to protect. For example, you can't protect all bridges, so which ones do you choose? Then you probably are familiar with Nash equilibrium. If you've seen A Beautiful Mind, there's that bar scene. It's pretty terrible in actually describing what Nash equilibrium is, but maybe you're a little familiar. It's often used to solve games, and this is very problematic. So what a Nash equilibrium is, it's just the optimal outcome of a non-cooperative game. So when you have different opponents that aren't working together, the players are making the best decisions for themselves, but they also are taking their opponent's decisions into account. So it's not just about, what's the most self-interested decision for me in a vacuum. I also have to think about what is my opponent going to do, and therefore what's best for me to do. It's good, again, as a language to delve into different conflict issues and apply insights across domains, but it's not a good way to come up with strategy itself. The prisoner's dilemma is probably the most famous. So two players commit a crime together, they get arrested, they're being interrogated. They have the option to confess or refuse. So if they both stay silent, you can see up here, they have a minimal amount of time that they have to serve, let's say a year. They both confess, they have to serve 2 years. But then if one confesses, they go free. When the other refuses, they spend, say, 4 years in jail, and vice versa. So you would think, obviously, the most self-interested option is to refuse because, that's the minimal amount of time. But what actually makes the most sense is you'll assume that the other player will confess against you because they can potentially go off free. So the optimal outcome ends up being both players confessing, which isn't necessarily an intuitive outcome, but that's ultimately what the Nash equilibrium means. So this is hopefully an illustrative example. But the problem is it's based on a priori reasoning. It's not based on what you see as far as players, how they're conducting themselves. So it's based on theoretical deduction rather than observation, which in a game like InfoSec is very problematic. Another big challenge is that when we conducted empirical experiments, people don't always know what game they're even playing, which obviously if you don't know the rules, it's hard for you to really figure out what you should do. And it's generally really unrealistic to assume that another player's actions long-term don't actually affect you because it can often cut off entire decision paths from you depending on what they do. And people have applied Nash equilibrium over the years. I would say that's the most common application of game theory, and some of the conclusions are things like you should play extremely fast as a defender, just go as quickly as possible, and that will cause the defender or the attacker to give up, which I don't think is quite right. Then there are really mind-blowing things like it's better to invest in security than not invest, regardless of a tracker strategy, which I think is not something anyone ever questioned. Or it's just apply tons of mathematical equations, which no CISO or security professional has time to do. So I propose that there's time for a new defensive framework. And to be clear, this leverages game theory as a language. Again, it's not a theory, but game theory is important for being able to describe these scenarios and describe what the InfoSec game is. So I want to explore how some sort of new framework would work, incorporating these behavioral insights we've seen from other experiments. So looking at data outside of game theory, like I said, from different experiments, you want to select the correct assumptions. So there's been a bunch of stuff around physical infrastructure, again, terrorism. There have been a few models with computer network attacks, but not very many. So it's a pretty green field as far as experimental evidence. But I think we have enough to go on to determine what game is InfoSec using this language. First, I would say it's a DAD game, and specifically continuous attack, continuous defense, given the nature of there's no real stopping point when you have attackers and defenders. I also argue it's non-zero sum. So, for example, in cases of industrial espionage, it's very hard for a company to quantify how much that actually hurts them. I would argue that, except in the really long term, and really it depends on their geographical distribution, it may not hurt them at all. So I think it's very hard to argue that the gain on the attacker side equals the loss on the defender side. I think there's also incomplete, imperfect, and asymmetrical information, and that's true for both sides. I think the opacity of information is something everyone is familiar with here. And it's also a sequential and dynamic game, so it's one step after another. It doesn't just end at a certain point. I would argue this is a uniquely tricky game. The only one that's even somewhat similar is a peace war game, which was popular kind of back in the Cold War, and that's based on the opacity of information, but even then it's a lot easier to conduct in many ways than the InfoSec game. Another question for you, have you heard InfoSec described as a cat and mouse game before? Few people. So traditional game theory doesn't actually allow for those, because you can't actually be one step ahead of your adversary in game theory because you already know what they're going to do. This is the part of the problem with extrapolating just from DAD games and that work, is because it relies on that traditional game theory. And again, as I mentioned, there's a few studies coming out that are examining behavioral insights, but we don't have a lot to go on yet. Obviously, assuming people are rational, they aren't. There are tons of books about that. I won't go into it, though in some of my prior work I've talked about that in depth. So you'll have to trust me from that. And then empirically, deviations from the Nash equilibrium are extremely common when we actually look at how humans behave. Even John Nash himself said, "I feel personally that the study of experimental games is the proper route of travel for finding the ultimate truth in relation to games as played by human players." So if he thought it was true, it's probably true, given he came up with the equilibrium. So what does a behavior-based framework entail? Now that we've described the InfoSec game, we have to look at how people actually behave and fit that behavior within that model of the game. And what experiments have shown is that people predict their opponent's moves either by thinking or learning, which sounds really obvious, and I'll get into what that means exactly. They've also looked into some neuroscience. I think it would be absolutely awesome to hook up an MRI machine to people conducting attacks, but I don't have $20,000 in my budget to work on this stuff. So if anyone has machines available, definitely talk to me. So thinking just means you are modeling how opponents are likely to respond. So this is before you've played against them, you're trying to figure out what they're going to do next. You also have to consider our brains work like volatile memory. It's a lot like DRAM, so we need constant refresh cycles, and we aren't very efficient. Working memory is a hard constraint for human thinking, and specifically, we have limits on the levels of high-order beliefs we can maintain, which just means if we're thinking about all the different steps an attacker can take going forward in response to us, in our heads alone, we have a very hard time kind of going beyond the next steps. Learning, in contrast, is predicting how players will behave based on prior rounds playing against them. So this takes over once you have some sort of prior experience to leverage. And again, I want to emphasize this is true for everyone, all humans, so both offense and defense. Humans learn through what's called error reinforcement learning, or you can just think of it as trial and error. People also have what are called learning rates, so it's how much experiences factor into their decision making. They also have this sort of X factor where they just want to randomly try new strategies, but the evidence so far is that learning plays probably the biggest component into how we make decisions. There are also things like dopamine neurons and code errors, which I think presents itself to interesting ideas, but I'm not going to explore that in this talk. There's one study in particular I want to emphasize just because I think the results are fascinating as far as how we think about strategy and really driving home why game theory alone is insufficient. So Wechsler and Buchler did a simulation of repeated security games, 200 of them, where attackers and defenders each had 4 strategies each, so a 4x4 payoff matrix, like in the prisoner's dilemma, but double that. Each attacker had different learning rates, and the goal was to examine the number of prevented attacks depending on defender strategy and what sort of learning rates the attackers had. And I'll talk about this a little bit later, so look out for the keyword model tracing later on in the talk. The results were that a fixed strategy, which is just choosing one defensive strategy the whole time, prevented 10 to 25% of attacks. A game theory strategy prevented about half of them, so it wasn't a perfect 25% distribution across each strategy. It was optimized depending on the level of payoffs for the attacker and defender. And a random strategy, which was 25% across all of them, worked pretty much just as well as game theory, which is really interesting. And the cognitive modeling strategy, which is when you start to take into account, okay, the attacker played, this sort of offensive strategy the first time. If it succeeds, they're more likely to play it next time. The prevention was between 61 to 77%, so that's a pretty meaningful increase. You can look at, in the appendix, I have suggested reading. It's the Know Your Enemy paper if you want to read more. The point here is that you don't want to be replaced by a security strategy algorithm that relies on random selection of defensive strategy, so don't use game theory. Instead, I'm going to talk about how you can implement some of these behavioral insights into what you do on the defensive side. A lot of this is really nice in theory, but you want to know how to use these on a practical level, obviously. So I'm going to be talking about first SWOT analyses. Then I'm going to go into thinking exploitation, learning exploitation, mini-max, and then looking ahead, what can we think about for the future? So first, a SWOT analysis. I did a super official Twitter poll. I think the results were that 10% of people, at least in my mentions or follower count, knew what a SWOT analysis was. I think it was about 60% didn't know what it was, and then 10% had actually used a SWOT before, 60% didn't know what a SWOT analysis was, and then the rest had never used a SWOT analysis but knew what it was. So I think it's important to delve into what it is. SWOT analyses were developed at Harvard Business School in the 1960s. They're used super often across different business units because it's good to think about for long-term planning strategy, but clearly the results of the official Twitter poll show that not many people are using them on the InfoSec side, which I think could be a mistake. So what SWOT analysis do? They look at strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, and the goal is to really evaluate how the objective of an organization is affected by internal and external factors that are favorable or unfavorable to achieve whatever that outcome is. So strengths and weaknesses are based on the internal factors. It's either what your available competencies are or what your weaknesses or lack of use of skills are. And the external factors can be anything from competition, regulation, technological change. I think the goal is to model a SWOT for yourself in relation to your adversary and model a SWOT for your adversary in relation to you. I'll show an example of a defensive SWOT in a second. Why it's important to think about your adversary is a game theory professor at NYU said, the primary insight of game theory is the importance of focusing on others, of putting yourself into the shoes of other players and trying to play out the reactions as far ahead as possible. So on the defensive side, I think this is very simplistic, but you could start with strengths. You understand the local environment, hopefully. You have a huge motivation not to be breached. The weaknesses are you may have an inadequate budget, you may have lack of personnel. I know it's a very competitive hiring market, and there's also lack of employee training. Phishing training works maybe for a month, and then it stops working so much after that. The opportunities are leveraging new technology, for example, containers for easy tear down and up of infrastructure. You are getting increased board attention from all the headlines like WannaCry, so you may get increased budget. And then threats can be, the attackers can also use new technology for scalability, for example, cloud services. And it's also really hard to keep up with the pace of change as far as your attack surface. But what's even better than this is perceptual SWOT, developed by that same game theory professor at NYU. So for you and your adversary, consider how can strengths be weaknesses and how can weaknesses be strengths, which sounds a little trite, but I promise it's worth it. So think of it like core competencies can actually be weaknesses. And for your adversary, you want to consider what's called a judo strategy. If you've done judo, and if you haven't, it's basically how do you use the opponent's weight against them to win the fight. So this is an example of a perceptual SWOT table. So for yourself, you may think what you have is a strength, but in reality it's a weakness. That's a threat. If you think it's a weakness, but it's actually a strength, that's an opportunity, and vice versa for your opponent. The way this can manifest, for example, Andrew Grove, the former CEO of Intel, said that what he thought the biggest core rigidity was actually top management. And the reason for that is that most of the time companies are in an evolutionary phase, right? So whoever was top management performed well in the status quo conditions, but as things change, they aren't actually prepared for what's coming up next. So it actually becomes a huge problem for the company. Compliance, I think, and fixed security guidelines, they may help initially to nudge people in the right direction for their security, but long term, they're actually creating more rigidity and more friction that can potentially hurt companies. Thinking about it from the other point of view, how can we start to leverage attackers' strengths and make them weaknesses? One example of an attacker's strength is having enough time to craft the attack. Defense, it's very reactionary, it's very quick, but attackers generally have enough time for recon. They can figure out how to craft something that will actually work. What you can do, and I'll talk about implementing this in a minute, is start to leverage that strength with strategies that lead them down rabbit holes and really waste their time, and leverage the fact that they do have a lot of time and they're willing to spend it. Another one is that attackers know about vulns. You may not know about all the vulns in your organization, and the attacker may have stuff you don't know about. What you can start to do is confuse them with fake architecture, make them unsure of what systems you actually have. That makes it a lot harder for them to actually use whatever vulns they have. From there, I want to go into thinking, or what I call thinking exploitation, which mostly it's kind of like Alex said, we want to try to make defense a little sexier, so calling it exploitation hopefully will help a little bit. So one strategy for this is belief prompting. In belief prompting, you want to increase the player's thinking by one step. Again, think about how is your opponent going to react. The goal here is to prompt the player to consider their opponents and how they'll react. You want to model assumptions around capital, time, equipment, risk aversion. If you've seen my prior work, you'll know that attackers tend to be way more risk averse than defenders, so that's something good to keep in mind. I actually take all of this further. Rather than modeling out one step, I suggest modeling entire decision trees for a variety of reasons, which I'll talk about in a second. And this is well supported by research. So I think there was one study where 33% of the time without belief prompting, people were able to successfully guess what their opponents would do. But when they started implementing belief prompting, that actually flipped, and they were able to predict it 66% of the time. So it's pretty effective. Your goal here with belief prompting is to ask, if I do X, how will that actually change my opponent's strategy? Here's a generic belief prompting guide. So first, think about how would attackers preemptively bypass whatever defensive move you implement. What will the opponent do next in response? What are the costs of the opponent's offensive move? I think this is something that is really underutilized in modeling potential adversaries and how they'll act against you. You really have to think about the cost of the attacker. And also, what's the probability that the opponent will conduct the move? Other questions are, which of our assets will attackers want? It's very hard. IT asset management is just hard for companies, but you should really be thinking about what do attackers actually want from us if you're going to model it out. So for example, a script kiddie lands on one of our servers, what will they do next? In belief prompting, you'll think about, okay, they'll perform local reconnaissance, they'll escalate to whatever privileges they can get. So you enforce privilege separation, you don't hard credentials, which hopefully everyone here is doing. This leads to the attacker has to actually exploit the server, and the risk there is that the server crashes. So you've just increased the riskiness to the attacker. So decision tree modeling is, I guess, the more official form of belief prompting, and something I think you can easily implement into your strategy, though it is a little manual today. I think it's good to think about, again, this is in the context of thinking exploitation. You want to start leveraging the fact that you can think ahead of your attackers and start to model out ahead of time before you've had a chance to, or before they had a chance to really act. So the goal here is you model decision trees both for offense and defense. and you show them together. So it's really like if this, then that. You want to theorize probabilities of each branch's outcome. So it's the likelihood that an attack will succeed, as well as the likelihood that a defensive measure will actually work. And I'll get into some ways that you can start to figure out what those might be. It creates tangible metrics to defer self-justification. So a lot of times, in all of life, we'll go back and think, oh yeah, like it was totally cool that I thought this way because X, Y, and Z. This actually shows, no, here were my assumptions, and here's where they went wrong. So these decision trees are basically just representations of sequential games. So again, using game theory as that overarching language, and I think that's why they're particularly useful. Dino Daizovi, who's fantastic in Speaking Tomorrow, had a great talk where he said attackers will take the least cost path through an attack graph from their start node to their goal node. That's important to keep in mind in these. So hopefully you can mostly see this. So this is an example of a very simplistic decision tree. It's a criminal group landing on a server running Linux, and they want to somehow, say, exfiltrate credentials from a database. So the easy path is what I call if someone is using YOLO security. In this case, they don't have any privilege separation. Obviously, you get root. If they YOLO even harder and don't have role separation, they can use the database on the box. And if they don't have tokenization or segmentation and do the final YOLO, they're able to get the credentials and actually exfiltrate data from the box successfully. The hard path, however, is, let's say you do have privilege separation, then the attacker has to use a known exploit or scan for reachable data. From there, you can implement like grsec or seccomp, and you start to get into the O-day realm or one-day realm, which, as I'll mention soon, is where you really want to get to. This obviously, what I call elite O-day versus grsec. That's obviously where you want the attacker to be because that's extremely expensive. So to model these out, the first thing is which of your assets do attackers want? You have to figure out what constitutes a win for the attacker. You also have to think about the easiest way for attackers to get to those assets. Again, thinking about, if you use the YOLO strategy, that makes it very easy to see how they would get there. You want to consider what countermeasures are already on that path or what countermeasures you could implement if you're thinking about adopting certain solutions. And finally, think about what new path the attacker will take given those countermeasures. How will that change what they're going to do? And I argue repeat 1 through 4 until it's O-day all the way down. That's the absolute hardest path for the attacker. Then from there, you assign rough probabilities. I think here you want to leverage things. This is actually a really useful application of threat intel. Red teams are also essential, which I'll get to. And you can also use things like, I know it's a little played out at this point, but the kill chain is a guide for like, here are the steps that an attacker will go through in order to conduct their attack. Ways to actually do it, because I've gotten a lot of questions in the past, like how do you actually do this? So you can just do it on a whiteboard collaboratively and take camera snaps or write do not erase for years and years. You can use draw.io or Glyphy because they plug into Confluence if you were an Atlassian shop. You can use Google Docs. It's just the option to insert drawing. PowerPoint, which is what I use. It's a bit cumbersome if you're creating very elaborate ones. Then finally, I would say Visio is a last resort. If you haven't used Visio, I hope you never do, but it is an option, so whatever works. So it's important to note decision trees help create a feedback loop to refine strategy. They help for auditing after an incident because it's really encoding here are our assumptions at this given time. Again, hopefully it's collaborative, so you've agreed as a team. And it ensures decisions are revisited. I think one problem that we see a lot in the industry is that a lot of companies are very additive only. They have solutions they may not even know that they still have. There's obviously very high turnover in our industry. It's very competitive, so it's easy just to be adding solutions rather than revisiting, hey, is what we're doing actually working? You can also update it if information on an attacker group comes out or specific methods. You can start to tweak those probabilities. It also provides a decision plan in the event of an incident. Again, it helps refine your decisions going forward, so it's good. It's a good part of any incident response plan. Then finally, it also mitigates what's called the doubling down strategy. So think about putting good money after bad. You don't want to do that, and by doing this, you can see, okay, this is the particular assumption that failed. Here's what we need to do instead. Another interesting thing is that you can look at the commonalities on the trees. So for example, my guess would be two-factor authentication. It would be on a bunch of different defensive branches, regardless of what type of attacker is and the different paths attackers take. So when you see it everywhere, you're starting to really eliminate the low-hanging fruit, which again raises the cost of the attacker. Your advantage should be that you know the home turf, and that's important to keep in mind both when you model this out and then also figuring out, again, what are the low-hanging fruit where we can slash basically certain attack paths and force them down other paths. And I also think this is one place to leverage your red teams and your penetration testers. So rather than the typical nice report that, frankly, pen testers and red teams absolutely hate writing, you should start making a new request from them and having them model out these decision trees. It should be more fun for them. They get to outline what they did and didn't try. You should also ask them what, in particular, are rabbit holes they went down where they were, for whatever reason, they couldn't continue. Probably to start off, a lot of your rabbit holes will be accidental. Well, what's interesting there is you can figure out what accidentally caused them to give up and start to implement that in practice. It also helps you see an attacker perspective of your organization, so seeing like how they're thinking about attacking you and what strategies are working and what aren't. So rather than just updating your decision tree after an incident, it's far better to be tested and be able to update it that way. So this moves into learning exploitation. So as a refresher, learning is what takes over. After you're done with the thinking, after you already have thought about what your opponent's going to do next, you've now played a round or two, you can start to think about what your opponent's going to do. And in particular, this learning exploitation is specifically how attackers learn and how you can take advantage of that. So I have two different types of exploitation here. The first is information asymmetry exploitation. Attackers learn just like everyone else. They factor past experiences into their decisions. So what you can do is start playing with that information asymmetry and disrupt that learning process. There's also learning rate exploitation. You can introduce unreliability and start to preempt moves. This is part of my kind of looking ahead talk, just because we have a little uncertainty as far as being able to measure how attackers actually learn. But there's still some things you can do today. First is that you want to exploit the fact, again, I'm going to be repeating this, that you understand the local environment better than attackers. If you don't, that's step one. I think IT asset management is something that's way under ignored. Rather than getting fancy sandboxes or whatever else, like get your IT asset management under control first and foremost. So first is falsifying data. The goal is to disrupt, again, the attacker learning process. We commonly think about information asymmetry as attackers know about the vulnerabilities, defenders don't. But there's actually asymmetry on the defensive side that you know the environment. Attackers have to figure out the way in. They have to figure out your systems. They have to figure out where whatever their pot of gold is actually is. They're also dealing with dynamic environments, so probably your systems are changing frequently. Things obviously change rapidly. That means it's attackers are basically constantly in some sort of learning process. And one strategy is to hide or falsify data on what's called the legitimate system side. There was an interesting study done involving energy harvesting communication systems and looking at DAD games involving jammers in those. What was interesting is that falsifying data on the, again, legitimate system side resulted in attackers being extremely confused about what to do and made jamming much more difficult. So the defensive performance was much higher. I think there's definitely more research to be done there. But an interesting case study, assuming it's true, I'm going to caveat this because we don't really have proof of it. But in theory, the Macron campaign came out and said that they used phishing tar pitting against the allegedly Russian government. So what they did is they used true and false logins and passwords. They signed on to phishing pages and planted these bogus credentials and other documents. They used like Cyrillic in some of the documents, had obvious fakes. I think one was showing a government official buying something on Alphabet or one of those darknet markets, which was very obviously fake, or we would assume so. So it's similar, if you know the meme, Waste His Time 2016, it was very popular on Twitter last year. I argue we should do that for attackers. The goal is that you want to make the attacker not know why they're failing and expend more resources in trying to figure that out. So the fancier way of saying that is you want to remove the attacker's scientific methods so they can't test their hypotheses. So if you want, come up with ideas. I'll probably come up with my own or post things. Waste Hacker Time 2017. I don't expect hashtags to ever take off, but it'd be kind of cool if it did. So one strategy is creating custom email rejection messages. So let's say you have some sort of email protection service in place. You can create custom responses if you think something's phishing. So create a honeydoc called the Avlock policy. Make it look like it was accidentally exposed online. What you can start to do is when suspicious emails get a reply, oh, this violates the Avlock policy, you can start to track when attackers actually look online at that policy document to see when they're starting to probe around and get a sense of when recon is happening. The general strategy is you want to create honey tokens that look like or describe legitimate policies or technologies that would be useful in attacker recon as a kind of early warning system. It's a lot easier rather than obfuscating whatever things are legitimate. Just put like a ton of crap out there and so the attacker can't know what's legitimate or not. In that vein, we can use non-determinism. Sorry. This just means whatever the action is, it has different behaviors at different times, and you can't expect the same result every time. Probably the most famous example of this is ASLR. So this is actually a non-deterministic feature, though it is highly deterministic in that it works kind of the same way every time. And I want to amplify that concept and expand it into higher levels. I think the goal here is that you want to raise the cost of attack at the very first step, which is recon. And this can, again, it's the idea of eliminating the low-hanging fruit. And even with sophisticated attackers, Alex was talking about it earlier today, sophisticated attackers will use very simple methods if they can, so you want to make them have to blow their O-Day on you. The goal is to make the attacker uncertain of your defensive environment and profile. So you want to really mess with their ability to profile whatever their target is. One example, which I'm sure many of you are familiar, attackers now design malware to be VM aware. I think that's a trend that's been exploding the past few years. A good idea is to make everything look like a malware analyst sandbox, and I'll get into how you can do this. An even better idea is making everything look like a different malware analyst sandbox each time. You can only afford so many sandboxes. I mean, I think FireEye now has much less expensive versions, but for a while it was, say, $250,000. Not everyone can afford that. So you want to keep attackers on their toes, and you want to make sure that they can't actually know whether it's FireEye or any one of the sandbox vendors, and really confuse them as to what's going on. So a way to think of it is putting wolf skins on the sheep, which is not the way you normally think about things. You want to mix and match what I call hollow but sketchy looking artifacts on normal physical systems, ideally at boot. There's a project called Rot Protect that does exactly this. It emulates virtual artifacts onto physical machines. The same guy has created the Unprotect project as well, which enumerates all the different ways that malware is looking to obfuscate itself or stop itself if it sees if it sees evidence of something that looks like a virtual machine, or if they see debugger tools and so forth. Some examples of things that you can emulate, obviously a bunch of different executables. You can just create this. Honestly, a lot of malware is just looking for specific strings on the system, so it isn't too easy to spoof it. You can also create things like Wireshark, because that looks like it could be on a malware analyst system. You could also spoof things to make it look like Cuckoo, add MAC address prefixes that look like something used in virtual machines. You can also create different sorts of drivers, different sorts of program folders, so forth. There are also things to make it look like there is a debugger present. What's really great is when you explore these things, and I encourage you to, is when people describe this, when malware is looking for these artifacts, they're looking for what's most reliable. So it also means on the reverse side, if you spoof like you are a debugger, it's a very reliable way of doing it, so it'll constantly be blurring out this loud noise, which is great. So debuggers register certain driver objects. You could pretend like you have those. There are certain things where base addresses of structures like this are static in Windows. Again, makes it look like you can reliably make it look like you're using one. You can also make it look like you have every sort of antivirus and different antivirus every time. So there are different, and this is, you can just Google dork this stuff. There are different sorts of DLLs that you can load. I would recommend using a forwarder DLL. So you load one, which loads a bunch of DLLs, and just load ideally different ones every time, just to make people confused about what you actually have. You can also, malware is also looking for evidence of hypervisors, so just deploy the lightest weight one that you have. I haven't tried these out, so choose your own. But again, if you mix and match all these things, you're definitely going to look like you're some sort of malware analyst, and a lot of malware today won't fire. At the very least, it'll cause attackers to have to figure out more how they need to craft their attack. This also gets into the idea of minimax. This was developed by John von Neumann, the notable polymath. And it's essentially that each player chooses a strategy from a position of complete ignorance concerning the other player's strategic choices, and they choose safely. So they want to minimize the possible loss for a worst-case maximum loss scenario. Dan Geer talked about it from the perspective of looking at evolutionary risk models and said you want to find the minimum of the sum of the expected cost of protection as well as the expected cost of non-protection. This is basically where it intersects. We're like, wow, we're going to get really screwed over if we don't have anything, and what the benefit is of a certain level of protection. I think there's a lot more research in Dan Geer's vein, which, by the way, this paper was 10 years ago. He's a prophet, around public health and other nature models, but I don't have too many weekends, so hopefully someone else will also look into it. Some of the ideas coming out of Minimax are very similar to non-determinism. You don't want to have a monoculture. Diversity is really strongly beneficial for protection. This is true in evolution. This is also true, I think, in InfoSec. You can reduce the idea of cascading failure or the idea of contagion through diversity of systems. Random or stochastic decisions also may be better than deterministic. We saw that from the Wechsler-Buchler study that random is better than fixed and is about equal to game theory. Then in the imitation game, if you've seen it, there's a scene where they're talking about the Enigma machine and whether they should use the information that comes out of it, or if they should act on it all of the time or none of the time. Obviously, neither of those work. You don't want people to know you're using it. So the answer is there's kind of this middle ground where you use it some of the time. With that, we want to look ahead. I think the nearest term thing is that with infrastructure 3.0, things like containers, the idea of fluctuating infrastructure makes it really hard for attackers to actually persist on systems, but it also makes it really hard for them to learn from their prior actions, particularly if you're using some of the mixing and matching strategies I mentioned. Netflix's Chaos Monkey was a way for them to test system reliability. It's also a really good way to implement this idea of fluctuating infrastructure. Beyond that, I think the key challenge is, remember I said to remember the word model tracing, and that's again thinking about how attackers actually learn. We want to start modeling attacker cognition. The problem is we don't actually know how to observe attacker cognition yet. I think honey tokens are a good start, kind of like the Avaloq policy where you want to see when attackers are probing systems. I think that's the best way to start figuring out how they're incorporating feedback into their model, but visibility is obviously a key challenge. Assuming we solve that, and keeping in mind that attacker preferences, anyone's preferences, change based on experience, you want to incorporate what's called the post-decision state. So you want to incorporate the feedback factor from learning in attackers. And keeping in mind the higher the attacker's learning rate, the easier it is to predict their decisions. Also, studies have shown you don't have to assume an initial risk rate that only changes kind of like detections by 1%, so it's pretty much negligible, which makes it easier. It's really simple math. So basically the change in the utility of an attacker action is the learning rate times whatever the feedback is minus the existing utility. So for example, if the learning rate is 20%, you get in a 1 for a win and -1 for loss. Then for a win, it's just 0.2 times 1, which is 0.2, so the attacker is 20% more likely to do an attack again. Therefore, if you're starting to see what actions an attacker is taking, you can start to figure out what the learning rate is, because you can see what they do after that, and from there you can start actually predicting attacker behavior. The goal is to track utility values for each attacker action. This is in this, again, future state. You should be able to know for detected or blocked actions what the action and outcome are, which makes it easy, and then you just look at what's the highest utility action from there. In conclusion, it's no longer time for some game theory, so tell people to be quiet when they tell you that. We've learned that game theory is actually a language. It's used to describe scenarios. It's used to describe the InfoSec game, but it's not a theory in itself, which now you can sound extra pretentious and correct people. Well, it's not actually a theory, it's a language. So hopefully that's a good takeaway. Start with a SWOT analysis to gain perspective of your position relative to your adversary and vice versa. You can use thinking exploitation, again, looking at how you predict behavior of your opponent to improve your threat modeling. You can use learning exploitation to beleaguer your adversaries, so keeping in mind they rely on prior experience, how can you waste their time? Then I argue we should work together to build strategies based on this behavioral framework. For example, if everyone emulates like their malware analyst sandbox, even malware analysts have a much easier time because attackers will adjust how they're crafting attacks. So I really think similar to network effects, they're really like defensive effects to some of these strategies. So it's really good to have some cooperation. The next step is how to begin model tracing attackers. So how do you start looking at how they're actually making decisions? Then from there, you can hopefully start predicting attacker behavior. I say you should try these at home. Try to make your blue team empirical. Like, frankly, at the very least, even if you use a completely random strategy, it's probably as good as whatever you're doing if it's based on game theory. So you might as well give it a try and hopefully share your results. And the final quote I like ending on because I think it's something that Alex talked about today. I think a lot of the industry is focused on how to make it perfect or there's a loophole or something, but really think about the fact that good enough is good enough. Good enough always beats perfect. The hard part is determining what's good enough, but you want some sort of self-sufficiency. You don't need to be an expert, and you want to be able to measure what you're doing. This will be posted online, so I don't expect you to be able to read all that. With that, thank you very much for your time.